Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening for the 2024 Townsend Lecture. I'm Carl Dahlman, Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I am here tonight on behalf of Dean Joel Samuels, who very much regrets that he could not be here himself, to introduce tonight's guest, Governor David Beasley. We have a number of distinguished guests in our audience this evening, including University Trustee Reed Sherrard. I saw Chief Justice Jean Toll has joined us this evening. We also have members of our College Board of Visitors, campus deans, members of the President's Cabinet, student government leaders, as well as leaders and representatives of state government and community leaders. Thank you all for being here. Your presence is testimony, no doubt, to the distinction of tonight's guest speaker. On behalf of the college, let me also thank Dean William Hubbard for hosting us tonight and for his help in inviting the governor to participate. Before we get to the introductions, let me begin with a word about the Townsend Lecture. Dr. J. Ives Townsend was a native of Greenwood, South Carolina. In 1996, as Professor Emeritus of the Medical College of Virginia at the Virginia Commonwealth University, he established an endowment at the University of South Carolina to fund the Townsend Lectures. The lectures honor his parents and grandparents, including Robert Wallace Townsend, who attended the University of South Carolina in 1883 to 1884. Following in the footsteps of his father, grandfather, and many other relatives, including two great-great-grandfathers who graduated from USC in the 1820s, Dr. Townsend attended the university and graduated from USC with a BS in chemistry and a minor in biology in 1941. He was also a member of Phi Beta Kappa. Dr. Townsend strongly believed that the sciences, the arts, and the humanities are not separate branches of knowledge, but should be integrated within an academic setting. In addition to being a scientist, he was a connoisseur of Southern art and architecture. Thus, in making his gift to the university, he stipulated that the lectures alternate between two topics: the impact of the biological sciences on society and Southern culture. He cared deeply for students and admitted that his true goal was to make a significant difference in their lives. He often stated, "Today's students deserve all that I am able to give them." Dr. Townsend passed away in 2005 at the age of 85. To introduce our distinguished speaker this evening, let me call to the, well, he's not going to come to the podium, but let me call on my colleague and the director of the Institute for Southern Studies, Carolina Distinguished Professor of History, Dr. Mark Smith.
Well, good evening, everyone. Lovely to see you. Thank you for turning out on such a beautiful Carolina night. It is my distinct honor to welcome Governor David Beasley as this year's Townsend Lecturer. I thank him for taking the time out of his colossally busy schedule to be with us here tonight. I also want to say some thanks to our College of Arts and Sciences ambassadors, Megan, Hannah, Morgan, who make this possible. It's a lot of work, a lot of underwriting, and also my fabulous people at the Institute for Southern Studies who really pull things together. Before we get going, a few observations. This is a recorded conversation. It will be on YouTube, on Spotify, and you can access this through our podcast, which is called Take on the South. How do you get there, you may ask? Outside, there's some merchandise. It is yours for the taking. On the merchandise is a QR code. Simply scan it, and hey presto, you're now in the web of Southern Studies. Lastly, at the end of our conversation, which will last about 45 minutes or so, we will invite questions, and you have some cards in front of you, and we would like you to write your questions down. One of the student ambassadors will give me those questions, and I'll get through as many as I can in the time that we have. So tonight is a conversation with someone who is extremely well known to both our state and our world. He is a native son of South Carolina, elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives at the tender age of 20 years old, served in the House from 1979 to 1995, when he became governor of our state until 1999. He then became a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School, received the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award, and went on to found the Center for Global Strategies. In 2017, he became the executive director of the United Nations World Food Programme, and in 2020 accepted the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to combat world hunger. I hasten to add that he is a University of South Carolina graduate. He did transfer from a school that I can't mention or really pronounce, frankly. I'm sure it's a very fine institution. He has not only his JD from here, but he has his BA in Interdisciplinary Studies, which warms my heart because Southern Studies is resolutely and unapologetically an interdisciplinary program. So please join me in welcoming Governor David Beasley as this year's Townsend Lecturer.
Thank you.
Interviewing you is something of a challenge because you've done a lot. But let's begin at the beginning. It would be helpful, I think, if you could share some of your earliest memories and how your upbringing, your family, your community, your faith shaped some of your core values. And I'll give you just a quick example. You grew up in Lamar, South Carolina, where in March 1970, one of the first racially integrated public schools in the South resulted in some horrific violence, public school buses overturned by a mob. And as you know, this made global news, national news. How did your family react to this? How did you react to this? How did this impact you during your very formative years of your life, David?
This is something I have never talked about publicly, ever. And I thought about this today when I actually tell a couple stories that have never been spoken by my family. That was a tough time. It truly divided our town. We were at a 99% white school, typical of southern schools and southern towns, and across the railroad tracks, so to speak, was a 99% black school. My mother was a school teacher, and my dad and I, we can talk more about this later, but my dad and mother were involved in civil rights back in the time period where blacks couldn't even register to vote. And boy, we've got stories about that as well. And when the forced integration took place, the whites left the school, and there was just riots, protests, school buses were turned over, and we were one of the only one or two families that stayed with the public school. And we were called, you can imagine what we were called. It was horrific. It really was. But what was really interesting, in spite of the fact that overnight I was, in the hall in the class of 99% people that looked like me, and all of a sudden I was a really big minority. Yeah. And I almost got beat up several times, but except for a couple big old black girlfriends who just were my defenders. Yeah. I mean, I could tell you some of the funniest stories you've ever heard in your life. And oh my gosh, I'm trying to say that I probably shouldn't tell that story, but that's after I die story. But what was interesting is the athletes, because in the slavery of the South and then the sharecropper system, most of the black athletes lived way out in the country. And so the school buses, they couldn't ride the school bus home and make it back for practice. Well, my home, and my mother was, you did not cross my mother. And she was just tough. She would fight fiercely for the least of these. And so they all came, not all, but 7, 8, 9 of them would come down to our house for afternoon after school, across the cotton field, and literally we would eat together almost every day. Why is that important? Because I sat at the dinner table in my formative years of my life with more blacks than whites, and body language and jive talk, and we were family. And after ball practice, my mom would have a car, my brother would have a car, and I'd have a car, and we would drive them home and get back about 11 o'clock at night from baseball practice, basketball practice, football practice, in a small school. And that impacted me more than anything about the equality of humanity. They were all equal. And God, these were my best friends. And I could walk anyway. Let me stop right there. Those were great years. And let me just share this. My dad, there was a civil rights leader that was involved with Martin Luther King and all them from Darlington, South Carolina, called Man Stanley. And he was my mentor. I loved him dearly. And blacks couldn't register to vote. They'd go to to the registrar's office and going to lunch, taking a break, a break that might last 6 hours or till Monday. And so I remember, I was a little kid, and I remember my dad with Man Stanley, because Man Stanley told me this later in life, and I vaguely remember it. But in Lamar, he had told me, he said, I'm going to get school buses, and you put all your people on school buses and bring them to Lamar at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning. We're going to block the main street off. We're going to have tables lined up on the streets, and we registered blacks all day long in Lamar. And Man Stanley told me that story about my dad, and how my mom and dad really were there in very, very difficult times. But it was brutal. You can imagine the death threats we got, and it was tough. But I wouldn't have traded those moments with my friends that impacted me, how I see people around the world, than anything.
We're going to get to that global stage, but let's fast forward just a few years. You're 20 years old. When I was 20 years old, the last thing that occurred to me was running for public office. I was doing things I shouldn't have been doing, probably. What inspired you, Governor, to enter what is quite a boisterous and sometimes vicious political world of South Carolina politics?
It was quite an ordeal. I had never voted before in my life. I wasn't even registered to vote. In fact, thank goodness they didn't have cell phones and everything back then. I was in the middle of the campaign, and I realized I wasn't even registered to vote. I had to go sneak into the election commission, or whatever we called it, and get registered to vote. There were no cameras or cell phones back then. And so anyway, I was at Clemson, a junior. I was playing ball, majoring in microbiology. Hardly anybody knows that, because I love molecular science. And boy, has that changed, and particularly with AI and everything. But anyway, I don't know why I ran. I don't really remember much detail. I just remember I had a yearning to help people. And I remember going home on the Christmas holidays in 1977. And my mother and father were divorced, and brutal divorce. And my father had served in the House of Representatives. I was a little kid. I don't remember any of that at all. And so I said something to my mom. I said, Mom, I'm thinking about running for the House of Representatives. I didn't even know who our House member was. And she, son is dirty, is corrupt, it'll get you too. And I was her baby boy. And that thing really hit me. And I was going snow skiing with a friend out in Colorado, and we would go drive. And all along that way, I was thinking, all right, could I be a pro ball player? When you're 20, you think you can do anything. I was not good enough. But I mean, how many people can you help playing ball sports? I was a doctor. I was planning on being a doctor. And you can help a lot of people. But I was thinking more romantically, an infinite number of people. And I was thinking about George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, that helped build a better system that perpetuated beyond their lives. And I thought, well, I can help the most people going through the political route. And so I made that decision to run, and that's a story in itself. You can imagine the questions I would get. Well, you're 20 years old. What do you know?
Right.
If you want to learn the American landscape, go campaign door to door. You don't do it much nowadays. Gene, back in the day, it was all door to door. And you'll meet every kind of possibility there is at a door. I mean, and probably more so now than even then, from getting bit by dogs, from whatever. Those were really fun times.
What do you say to somebody who says, you're 20 years old, what do you know?
Very simple. We young people didn't cause all these problems. How about give us a chance to be part of the solution?
Nice.
And I don't have the answers to all the problems, but who does?
Very good.
And I would say, wouldn't you rather be young than old? And of course, everybody's, yeah. But let me tell you one real quick story. I remember the first day I'm walking on the floor, and the Gamecock had been in the state newspaper, had been doing all these stories about this 21-year-old kid, and they'd have Marion Gressett picture and me a picture facing off, and of course, Marion Gressett, remember, dentist, they'd be laughing at this stuff. And I'm, it's pumping me up. I'm this cocky little kid anyway, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I've arrived. And so first day on the floor of the House of Representatives, I walk up those stairs, and they got the mahogany doors on the outside going into the chamber. You got the little foyer or loggia, whatever you call it. And then you got the inner door. Well, the door's open for me, and I'm like, and my dad had told me, he says, son, whatever you do, you get to know Speaker Saul Blott. He can teach you the ropes. And I thought, okay, I'll go meet this guy someday. So those doors opened for me, and I'm like, well, they're opening for me, you know. And the second door's open, and they're opening for me, and I walk on the floor, and there's Saul Blott standing there, and I'm like, this is destiny. There he is to meet me. So I go to walk up to him to shake his hand, and he says, son, get me a cup of coffee. And I've got to make a split decision. Do you know who I am? I'm the future. Or black sugar cream, which is what I did. And so I turned, and all the pages are frozen because they know what's going on. I don't know what a coffee machine is. And there's a female page at the door, and she goes like that. And so I'm like, okay. So I go over to the coffee machine. Gene used to be back in that corner back down on the right. And I went and got the coffee and bring it to him, and I handed it to him. And, you know, if you're a page, you just walk off. And he looks at me because I didn't walk off. And this is a millisecond. And he looks at me like, why are you still standing there? He didn't say that. And I said, Mr. Speaker, I'm David Beasley. And son, I am so sorry. I thought you were Paige. Well, anyway, he took me under his wings and taught me the ropes. And we'll talk about more ropes I learned inside that chamber from a colleague sitting right here.
Well, that's interesting, because the next question I was going to ask you is, you know, what were your main challenges apart from serving coffee? At such an early age to go into the House of Representatives, and then you become the youngest majority leader in the nation of any state. I mean, how do you navigate that world? Because it is a complex world, isn't it? And it's fraught. Missteps, you will pay a heavy price for missteps.
Well, you know, in Gene, back at that time, the majority leader was ceremonial. It had really no authority. So that in itself, and I was youngest chairman of the Education Committee, but the key point, though, was, and we fought this together, a lot of the old guard that didn't want to give up anything. And some people I highly respected, but they needed to move on because we knew we needed to build a more progressive state for a brighter future. And so I challenged some, as did Gene and as did Bob, and there's some stories there. And one of the things that I think was very important was because the eyes of particularly the youth and the media was on me, it was really critical that I didn't go up there and just run my mouth all the time. That when I did go up there, you knew what you were saying. Because you went up there and didn't know what you were saying, somebody like Gene Toll would just rip you down on the floor of the House. I mean, not disrespectfully. I mean, people ask me, how did I learn how to deal with the Taliban? Well, I learned how to deal with Gene Toll on the floor of the House. I mean, she trained me how to, and I say this respectfully because she was always articulate, always respectful, but always passionate and fight. And my mother taught me that. My dad taught me that. Stand up for what you believe, but do it respectfully. And so I didn't go up there and talk a lot my first couple of years. I really learned and tried to earn respect. And then when I did speak, I tried to make certain that I didn't make big mistakes. We had an incredible number of young people across the state started running for the House and the Senate over the next 4, 6, 8 years. And now they're the old guys who are leaving, Wes Hayes and Larry Martin and guys like that. But those were great, great years. And by the way, it was on the floor of that house that I met my wife from Alabama.
So that wouldn't be one of the challenges, meeting wives on the floor.
Oh, they don't let folks on the floor like that anymore. But
quite good to know, really. Let's move on to your time as governor of this state. But I'm very curious, so back up before we get into what you did, which was a lot. Can you tell me about your primary against Senator Arthur Ravenel, and then the election itself against Lieutenant Governor Nick Theodore? Were these hard? Were they difficult? Were they challenging?
Well, I'd been a Democrat all my life. Right. And I lived in the most Democrat area of the state. And here I was with no base, running as a Republican. And I had Tommy Hartnett, Arthur Ravenel, Corson. There was about 6 or 7, pedigreed Republicans. And here was this, Johnny-come-lately guy to the game. And old cousin Arthur. So it ends up in the final. We end up in the final primary, and I remember I was at 1% in the polls, and I was just campaigning so hard across the state of South Carolina, and it was a changing dynamic politically in the South at the time, and I was just working so hard, but my poll numbers weren't moving. They're not going to move. I don't care how much one-on-one campaign you do until you go on television. Well, I remember, he and Tommy Hartnett had all this money from Congress, all this congressional PAC money that you could just freely move over at the time, which shouldn't be done, but anyway. So he goes up on his first commercial, and I am going to do an event in Greenville up in Travelers Rest, old Travelers Rest, not the new Travelers Rest. And it's a chicken bog. And he's got this ad that hits, and I'm like, oh my gosh. And it's like, I'm cousin Arthur Avenel, and I'm going to be up here on the upstate like white on rice. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to this real country chicken bog, and it's down a dirt road, and I drive up, and there's a big old cast iron pot about that big, like that, and he's a big old boy. He got an old pair of overalls on. One of them's not clipped over here, and he weighs about 300 pounds, and he's stirring that thing with a paddle. And I'm thinking, I'm going to ask that guy right there if he's seen that commercial. Because if he sees that commercial and he likes it, I'm in trouble. And I figured if anybody's going to like that commercial, it's that boy right there. And I get out the car, and I'm all by myself because I didn't have anybody, I didn't have enough money to hire somebody to drive me at that time. And I get out and I walk over there and I say, I'm David Beasley. He said, have you seen that commercial, that Ravenel? I said, yes, sir. He said, that's the dumbest commercial I've ever seen. When he said that, I said, it is over. and he was so great to campaign with and against. I mean, I got so many stories with him. He's so funny, so colorful. I really enjoyed him. Nick was a different ballgame because Nick was so loved across the state. His daughter, his son, we were very close. We were at Carolina together. We dated the same people. And it was hard in a lot of ways because I was very close to the Greek community. Yeah. And I remember this one particular incident because Nick was about unbeatable. And people forget about that. Mm-hmm. And I was trying to showcase, hey, I love Nick. He's a great guy, but it's the time for a younger generation of the future. And I remember he was going to pull a gimmick at the NBC debate up in Greenville like 3 nights before the election. And there's this old famous line. I didn't know what it was going to be. I knew he was going to do something. It's a stand-up. He's at his podium about 8 feet away, and I'm, on the right, on this side. And so I know he's doing something. I don't know what it is. So I'm waiting, as you're answering the questions. And so it was showtime. He's asked a question, and he looks over at me, and I said, oh, here it is. And there's this old famous line, and it's said by many politicians around the world in the last 180, 200 years. I'll quit telling the truth about you if you quit telling lies about me. So Nick... And if you remember, I can't remember what was the old cartoonist at the state newspaper, Rob Ariel. He had just done this famous cartoon about Lion King was out, and I'm the Lion King. No, I'm the Lion King, not Lion. And so Nick stops and he looks over at me and he says, I'll quit telling lies about you if you quit telling the truth about me. And I'm like, did he say that? And I'm like, he couldn't have said that. And I'm like, but I know he said that. Your mind's going a million miles an hour, and you've got to make a decision quick. And I'm thinking, all right, do I rip him right now and give him a chance to recover, or the media is going to tear him apart? So I decided to let it go. And sure enough, he did say exactly what I thought he said, but it was so intense up there. Yeah. And so we're walking off the stage and in the debate, and you go into your debriefing room, and Drew, his son, was right in front of Dad, and we were kind of walking at the same time. And Nick was so proud; he thought he'd done so good, and he did all right, other than that one line. And and quite frankly, debates don't really determine whether you'll be a good president or a good governor. They really don't. But it's just the way it is. And he was so proud. I did good, didn't I, son? Something like that. And I heard that, and Drew looked at him like, Dad, we got a problem. And I called Drew. Must have been about a year or two later. I said, Drew, you remember that night? And he says, oh, yeah, I do. And I said, what happened? He said, Dad didn't believe he said that. He said, we had to go get the tape. Now you just pull it right off. He said, we had to go get the tape in the room and show that he said that. But anyway, Nick Theodore is a great American, a wonderful person. And, if you want to see two leaders run together for the same position, and no matter what happens, you end up okay. Yeah. That's America, and I love his family. But anyway, that was a tough election. He had a tough primary with Dick, not Dick Riley, but Joe. Oh my goodness! And I see Joe down in Charleston every now and then now, but we're all old now.
So you win. A remarkable win under the circumstances, young, hard people to beat. You become governor. And I had just arrived here in 1996 as a faculty member, so I remember this, And here you are, during your term, you come out against video poker, gambling, you make a decision to remove the Confederate flag from the State House dome. I'm really curious, Governor, what guided your thinking? What were the impacts on your election? And candidly, would it have been better to wait until after the election to make those decisions?
Yeah. There's no way I would have been defeated had I not touched those issues. No way. My polling numbers were out of the roof. But that's just not me. I'm a risk-taking. I made the conclusion that it needed to be addressed before the election. And I get that instinct of willing to risk it all for my mother, really. She's a fighter and a warrior, this kind of thing. And but my staff was like, don't do both at the same time. Nah, we could do both at the same time. And I remember the night that I lost, and nobody could believe it. And I brought the team in. I said, I want to ask you 3 questions. And everybody they were so disappointed, disillusioned. I said, did we do what was right? And my whole team, I'm right there. Before I went live on TV, because NBC, CBS, ABC, all of them, because it was me, George Bush, Tom Ridge, they were being talked about on the national scene. And I said, did we do what was right? And every one of them said, yes. I said, all right. Number 2, when we did what was right, did we do it at the right time? Because there are a lot of politicians who stand for what is right when it won't cost them anything. But will you stand when it will cost you everything in your mind? Yep. And they said, we wish you had waited, but they said yes. I said, all right. So when we did what was right at the right time, did we do it the right way? Mm-hmm. Not out of judgment, division, condemnation, but out of bringing the state and people together. And they said yes. I said, well, we've been successful. Mm. When you go back in time, not many people remember what was taking place. You had the KK Museum, you had a white cop with a black lady on the I-95, and there were several other incidents that were taking place at the same time. Now, on top of all that, we had already passed every major piece of legislation, from economic reform to welfare reform, tax structures, educational systems. In the African American community, well, you support that flag, and wouldn't listen. And I felt like it was just an incredible. I'm going to talk more about the flag a little bit later, but it was an incredible impediment to be able to deliver a message that all people would hear. And I felt that it was the right time to do it for a bigger reason, and that is we're all created equal and we all should be respected. But the flag itself wouldn't have beat me. The video poker wouldn't have beat me by itself. But the $25-30 million that was put in along with the flag, along with the fact that we say stupid things from time to time, all of that gave Jim Hodges, who is a friend and was a good governor, and I don't regret a single decision I made. I might not have talked about how fast I was, but I probably would have. Most of you don't remember. Gee, you remember?
So
anyway,
so do you have any regrets as governor?
No, I really don't. I don't. I'm not a look back kind of person. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there was some mistakes I made, but I can't think of anything that I would have done differently. I definitely would not have waited on either of those 2 issues. Sometimes someone has got to take a bullet for the cause, and it was worth every bit of it.
As you mentioned, you did a hell of a lot in those 4 years. What was, in your estimation, your signal achievement, the thing that you're most proud of as governor?
losing for what was right to do. Because you were willing to suffer defeat for the most important value in your personal life, and that is we're all created equal. We're all created in the image of God. And that flag was very clear that there was a population in our state that was not equal. And South Carolina is better than that. It's hard to believe this, but how controversial it was. And I had two national figures call me in the midst of that debate. One was George Bush. Hey, brother, I know what you're going through. And the other was Hillary Clinton. Really quite remarkable. Both of them calling, what can we do? How can we help? Because they knew politics. And it was so vicious. We actually had to send our children out of state for a couple of weeks. We had so many death threats. We didn't talk about that publicly. And I can remember the flag protesters would show up at every event I was doing. They would bust them in. There'd be hundreds of them out there. And I'd walk over there, and my security was going nuts. I'd walk over there, start talking to them. After about 15 or 20 of those times, they'd like, well, we do like you, but we just don't agree with you on the flag. But years later, the number of people that found that taking the flag down that was a no-brainer. It was, people around the world can't understand why was that even an issue. It'd be like taking Mother Mary out of the Catholic Church. I mean, it was a big deal down here. It really, really was. But we're better for it now. And I remember when you had this white racist kid killed the 9 black African members of Emmanuel down in Charleston. I got a phone call to come to the Senate. And the Senate is where I got the breath beat out of me on the flag. Glenn McConnell and that whole crowd. Of course, all of them. And Nikki made the decision to call everybody back in, which was a great decision. We talked about it, and I said, you got to do it, and the timing is right. Of course, no matter when you call, people go, oh, she's playing politics, yes, that kind of thing. And it just was the perfect time. So my first role was to go to the Senate. So I'm taken into the back stairs, and they're debating the issue on the Senate floor. And I come in from that back corner, and whoever the speaker was, I don't remember who it was, sees me and stops. Well, when he stops, the whole Senate chamber turns and sees me walking in. And my last appearance was my defeat. So they're seeing, as I think it was Bob Novak, who was a great columnist, and David Broder, who said, you are the last living casualty of the Civil War, this kind of thing. And it's a great line, but, whatever. And so the entire Senate chamber stopped, froze, and stood up and gave a standing ovation. And we all, I think half of us was tearing up and hugging, and I was like, well, there's nothing I need to say here. We've won the Senate. Yeah. So I'm walking over to the House side, and the whole lobby area is packed with flag protesters, all sides, very intense. And I'm about halfway over, trying to get to the House chamber, and there was Trey McMaster's chief of staff. Trey Walker. Trey Walker had been one of my biggest supporters I had, he and his dad. But when I said take the flag down, they became my biggest enemy. Very personal. And I'm walking across, and he's a big old tall boy. And I hear this say, hey, Governor. And I look over, and about 40 feet away, there's this Trey. And I'm like, oh, no, I don't want to see that guy, because I'm not going to have the temperature of Jesus and love my enemy. I ain't. And he gets to me, and I'm not in a good mood about talking to him. And he says, I want you to know that I've changed. I said, what do you mean you changed? That white racist that killed those black folks draped in the Confederate flag, that changed? He said, no, that broke my heart. Then I kind of like, I realized, all right. I said, so what changed your heart? He says, when those families forgave that boy. 3 days later, he said, that changed my heart. And when he told me that, I said, that's it. We've got to change the dialogue. I went straight down to Nikki. I said, I'm going on television. We're moving that flag because we love our neighbor. We care for our neighbor. We're not doing it out of politics. The number of phone calls I got from leaders around the world, I'm talking about Muslim leaders, atheist leaders, Buddhist leaders, Hindu leaders, Orthodox leaders, when they saw those black family members forgive this white boy, an unconditional, unforgivable sin, probably by me. And they saw pure, unconditional love. It was the most powerful, probably explosive event since World War II. And I told those family members that they did more to impact the world by planting that seed. Well, what people didn't realize, if you recall, 2 months before that happened, give or take, there was this white cop in North Charleston that shot this black guy in the back. I was in Brazil meeting with leaders. I get a phone call by one of my security guys and said, hey, we had a white officer shooting a black. I said, I want you to make 2 phone calls, and here's what I want you to ask, and I want you to call me back. They call me back within a few minutes. I said, all right, here's what's got to be done. Well, anyway, Anderson Cooper with CNN was down in Charleston and found the mother of that black killed guy. And he wasn't race baiting, but he was kind of, this white guy, cop kills your, and she just kind of pushed back, says, I know I shouldn't forgive that guy. I know I should hate him with all of my heart. But Jesus told me to forgive that guy. I forgive him. I forgive him with all my heart. I know it's hard. She planted the seed of forgiveness that didn't go viral around the world, but it went viral in Charleston. She planted that seed, and nobody knows that woman. To me, she's like the number one hero of the most powerful message that the whole world needs right now, and that is forgiveness and reconciliation, because the number one issue in the world today is division and brokenness. But anyway.
That's a nice segue to my next question. So you go on to head up what is the world's largest humanitarian organization, the United Nations World Food Program. Can you knit things together a bit here so that your experience in South Carolina politics, or just South Carolina generally, how did that influence what you did at the UN? Did it speak to things directly, or was it more subtle than that?
It was a combination of things. I think the values that we grew up with is family and faith and living in small communities. I mean, Columbia is a small community compared to New York or Paris or London. And you have to get along. I mean, Democrats, Republicans, black, white, left, right, sometimes the Baptist Jesus and the Catholic Jesus don't talk to each other, but that's a different discussion. But by and large, we got to get along. And we do. And you learn how to get along. My best friends on the floor of the House were usually my biggest enemies on an issue. I mean, Jim Mattis and Harriet Kaiser, oh my goodness, we would fight it out over there, and then we would go have lunch and dinner together, and people, how do you do that? I said, because I love people that stand up for what they believe in. It's the ones that stand up and they don't really believe it, and they wishy-washy, and they change their positions, and you're always kind of respectful, but those aren't the ones. It's you didn't ever have to worry about where Gene Toll stood. You never had to worry about it. But you learn, I mean, she was older than me, and I was a young kid learning from these masters of debate and respect and civility. And also, this was very important, because growing up in the South, where the families had a lot of memories from the Civil War. My great-grandmother was 40-something years old when she had my grandmother. And my grandmother was 40-something years old when she had my mother. So I used to hear firsthand stories about post-Civil War and how people were treated. And it taught me a lesson. How we treat our enemy after a war determines how fast the whole country comes back together. I've used that about what happened in the South, how long it took us to reconcile and get over it, because how we treated each other after the war. And I've gone into the country and said, you've got to learn, reach out to your enemy. And we would go through details of how to reconcile a nation and bring it back together. There's certain elements you can't. You deal with that. But by and large, people that are on this side or that side are willing to come together. Most all, except for a few radicals. And so learning these values and these traits that I learned here, growing up, and the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, of love your neighbor as yourself. I never understood the grasp of what that is. And it doesn't matter whether you see Jesus as just as a man like a lot of the world does, or as a prophet like the Muslim population, or as a savior. The teaching of love your neighbor as yourself comes back to the Torah. Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, this is the essence of everything I believe. So this Jewish rabbi, years ago, who teaches the Pope and the cardinals twice a year. He's from New York, goes there twice a year. He's arguably the leading authority in the world on the Jewishness of Jesus. Incredible guy. He and I became great friends. He said, you know that verse you quote all the time from the Torah? I said, yeah, Leviticus 19:18. He said, you know that actual, more historic, accurate translation is to love your neighbor as your equal. Because you're made in the image of God. And if you're all made in the image of God, you're all equal and yet all special. And when he said that, it totally took a whole new dimension in life. And I learned these basic values from here, but learned them deeper in life. And so people would ask, how do you stay positive out there? You're all over the world. And I said, because every child I see starving to death, I see that as my little brother, my little sister. That's the image of God. And Jesus said, when I was hungry, you did not feed me. And he said, when you didn't do it to the least of these, you see, when you didn't do it to the image of God, you didn't do it to God. And so I see that as my moral obligation. And I remember Scott Pelley, Scott Pelley was 60 Minutes. Scott Pelley and I were doing this incredible, tough story. And it moved the White House, and all the Democrat Republican leaders in Washington shifted public opinion in 24 hours. And I was able to completely undo the blockade with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. on Hadida port in Yemen. And Scott was so moved by the stories of what we were doing out there, helping the poor and helping the needy. And we were demiking, and he says, Governor, you got the greatest job on the planet, saving the lives of millions of people every day. And I said, Scott, I do. But I'm going to tell you something you haven't thought of, and it's going to bother you. And Scott looked at me like, what could that be? I said, I don't go to bed at night thinking about the children we saved. I said, I go to bed at night brokenhearted over the children I couldn't reach. And when I don't have the access or the money, we have to choose which children eat, which children don't eat, which children live, which children die. It's not hypothetical with us. How would you like that job, Scott? And Scott looked at me like, oh my God, I never thought about that. And I said, well, we have to deal with it every day. And then he said, how do you stay positive? I said, when I'm out there in a war-stricken country, it could be in the rubbles of Damascus or Deir ez-Zor or Kandahar or Hadida, Sinai. I said, you see these little children, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, come out from behind that rubble of which there's nothing but darkness, just evil. And it's like a flower in the desert. And it gives you hope. And I'm not giving up on that child. It doesn't matter their sex, their race, their religion. That's my little brother. That's my little sister. That's the image of the Almighty. We're all created equal. And that's what motivated, in my opinion, and I used that in the Nobel Peace Prize speech. And my entire team around the world, regardless of their religion, really believe that. And they're inspired by that around the world, you know.
I've never been in a position to ask this question, and it's very unlikely that I'll be in it again, so I'm going to ask it. What's it like to win a Nobel Peace Prize?
You know, you don't get that phone call every day.
I bet you don't.
a year or two before, I was would go to Oslo because I'm raising money from capitals all over the world, and I was at the same hotel where they present you to the public, and I'm actually staying in that room, and me and my guy who was with me, my body guy, he said, wouldn't that be kind of cool if we stood up there one day? I said, man, would that not be cool? I said, that ain't gonna ever happen. You know, we laughed about it and went on. Well, the next year, we get a phone call that we might get it. And so we get all prepared. I get a speech ready. I got my suit. You know, it's always announced at a certain time. I'm in Rome. I don't travel. I'm going to be ready for television. Yeah. Don't get the phone call. I tell my team, I said, don't ever bring this up to me again. Never. We do what we do because we do it for the right reason, no other reason. Don't bring it up. So a year later, I'm in Niamey in Niger, and I've got ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and destabilization taking place, and I'm in a big fight with the military. And I was just out there trying to move supply chains because we were feeding, my last year, we were feeding 160 million people on any given day, week, and month. So our supply chain systems are critical. I was raising $39.2 million per day. When I arrived, we were raising 10. So I'm very strategic of who I meet with, where I go, how I do it, and why I do it. And so if I don't get access to this population, because I had ISIS about 10 miles to the south of me and about Al-Qaeda 10 miles to the north, and they shut down supply chain systems so that people starve, can't get medicines, and they recruit. And I've had more moms tell me my brother, my son, my husband, my daughter didn't want to join ISIS, but Mr. Beasley, we hadn't fed our child for 2 weeks. What were we supposed to do? It's not like they can jump in a car and drive to Greenville. It don't work that way there. So if I don't break that access, recruitment, destabilization increases. And we usually can tell you within 12 to 24 months at what point a country's going to collapse. Because if I fed everybody in this room every day for 2 years, I know what's going on in your neighborhoods. I know where ISIS is. I know where they're moving. I know what's happening. So I'm in a dogfight. I'm back out of the countryside, back into Niamey, and my phone is sitting on the coffee table upside down, and it's just blowing up. And I'm like, what? And I'm beating the general and the president. He and I developed a good relationship. And I got to have access. If I don't, ISIS, Al-Qaeda are going to continue to grow, and they go overthrow you, yada, 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 yada. By that time, somebody busts into the room. My guy. And I'm like, I'm going to knock your head off. What are you doing? You know? And he says, Nobel Peace Prize. And I'm like, oh, yeah, who won it? He says, you did. We did. And I was like, you're kidding me. Well, the general gave me what I wanted.
Shocking.
And I get this phone call, but I can't hardly hear because I'm in Niamey. I mean, the communication's not good. And I'm talking to the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, and I can't really hear a word they say. I need to go listen to it because I think he's telling me we got the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, anyway, it's pretty exciting. Well, who's the first person you want to call?
Your mum.
Yeah, well, mom's dead, so call my wife.
Your wife. There you go.
So my mom, who was gone, so Mary Wood was not in Rome. She had gone to Austin, Texas to see our son, and with the baby just born, I can't remember. Yeah. Well, there's a time difference. When you get a call at 3 a.m, either you're going to pick your son up out of the jail or you're going to the morgue. It's one of the two. It is not ever good. Right. I didn't know this, and she doesn't have these kind of dreams, but she had, which was highly likely, because 80% of my operations are in war zones. Yeah. So I'm dealing with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, and Al-Shabaab, and the Taliban and the Houthis and all this all over the place. I know how to negotiate because Gene taught me how to negotiate. And so the first person I want to call is Mary Wood. But she had a dream the night before, which I didn't know, that I was killed in Niamey. And the probabilities weren't low. And I got some stories about that. So she answers the phone 3 a.m. in Austin, Texas. And I go to say Nobel Peace Prize, but before I can say it, I break up. I'm emotional. So she hears her husband breaking up kind of on the phone, thinking, oh my goodness, he's trying to say I love you before he dies. And so probably 15, 20 seconds pass, and I finally get the words out, Nobel Peace Prize. Oh, that's all? No. And I am so grateful, Mark, because if I had done the stories that I did with BBC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox, Al Jazeera, all over the world, from Rome in a beautiful, ivory tower versus I was in the Sahel, in the hardest places on the planet, and it went global. And it raised the awareness around every leader in the world. And over the next year, I had every president, prime minister using my talking lines without being prompted to. And it was tremendous. It really was. I mean, the head of Microsoft, I couldn't get a meeting at Davos with the head of Microsoft. Now, they're calling me, wanting to talk, I need your money. Anyway, that was a pretty big day.
Yeah, I bet. That sounds amazing. I can't think of anybody that has probably been in more places or more deeply involved in the fundamental issues facing humanity in the last decade. You're front and center on this. I want to ask your opinion. What is your assessment of the state of the planet and the state of our country vis-a-vis those issues?
It's not good. In fact, this morning, me and Senate leadership did a press conference. Chris Coons, John Bozeman, Jake Sullivan, head of NSC, Samantha Power. So we did a press conference today talking about global food security. When I took this role at the World Food Program, there were 80 million people marching towards starvation. And I took this job not wanting it. I did not want the job. That's a whole nother story in itself. But the Democrats and Republicans in the Senate said, you're the only person that can talk Trump out of zeroing out international aid. And I said, well, let me talk him out of it. I don't want a job. Well, anyway, I took the job. And I thought 80 million people, I could put the World Food Program out of business. 80 million people out of 7.6 billion at the time, with 360 or 70 trillion dollars worth of wealth, new technology, advanced systems. When you think about the fact that 200 years ago, when the world's population was 1.1 billion, there was 95% of the people in extreme poverty. Think about that. Today, or 6, 7 years ago when I took this role, less than 10%. So we have built systems and programs and institutions just sharing more wealth than any time period in world history. But try telling that to the 10%. And the answer is, as I tell the young people, is not throwing out the systems that's working for the 90, but tweaking it, making it better so we reach that final 10%. We cannot stop until we reach that final 10%. Well, anyway, 80 million that were marching to starvation, not chronic hunger, that's a different story. I thought, I can put the need for the World Food Program out of business. I've been a former governor. We set goals, objectives, benchmarks, measurables, put together a team, and we execute. Well, the number went from 80 million to 135 million in a year, my first year. Why? Man-made conflict. 2, climate shocks. You can debate what causes the climate change, but I can tell you, I'm out there. I've seen it firsthand. And that's a whole nother discussion. So the next year, guess what comes along? COVID. Supply chain disruption. African countries are already extreme debt. They can't afford more debt. They were paying more in debt than social programs. So here I am beating the drums, rallying the troops, and it goes to 275 million people, not knowing where their next meal is coming from. These are the people that end up in migration, destabilization, recruitment by extremist groups, in addition to famine and starvation and death. So just when you think it can't get any worse, the breadbasket of the world, Ukraine, is invaded by Russia. Yeah. The number goes to 350 million people. I go into Odessa immediately. I'm in Kiev. I'm all over the place. And I do that famous tweet to Putin. You're bringing famine to Africa if you don't unlock this blockade on the Odessa port. Because they grew enough food to feed 400 million people. And so it was devastating. We were buying half of our food from inside Ukraine. Let's not even get into the fertilizer issue, because 40% of all the base product for fertilizer production in the world comes from Russia. And you have to have fertilizer. We can feed 4 billion people without it. We can feed 8 billion with it. And so I had some pretty hard conversations. And so I had I don't want to say this. I had someone inside Putin's office. You know, when you're feeding all these people around the world, you got people everywhere. So we had people in his office. And when I tweeted that tweet to him, someone in his office made the comment that got back to me within a matter of minutes, that Putin said, I did not want to be seen as bringing famine to the world. And I knew then I had a window. I've never said this publicly. I'm probably plausible deniability, I don't know. But we negotiated the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And we were able to start moving supplies. But that's, again, a whole nother discussion. In fact, part of the discussion this morning was how Africa, for example, needs not to be subjected to nations that may hold vulnerable minerals, very critical minerals. How do we, like whether it's fertilizers or food or things like that, how do we create some degree of independence globally, so that if there is a country around the world that controls certain elements, that we're not held hostage by that country. And this is, to me, pushing fertilizer production, as well as AI, where we're dealing with, like, for example, I don't know if this is public yet, but there's a particular company that's about to announce a new seed for maize, corn, that does not require fertilizer. That might not be a big deal to you here in South Carolina, but take a smallholder farmer in Africa who can't afford fertilizer, who can't afford fuel, barely making ends meet, and 70% of the people in Africa are fed by smallholder farmers. In Africa, I mean, I love Africa, and the youth in Africa. I mean, this right here is a two-edged sword. I don't know yet, and I've told my class, and the dean over here is about falling out of his chair a couple of times, because I said this at my private meetings with the G7 and the G20, because I don't read speeches at the G7 and G20. I just talk to them like this. And I said, this is bringing an end to democracy as you know it within 15 years. And I believe that, until we find a way to curb the misinformation, disinformation, the propaganda, because we're more divided than any time period in world history. But yet we're more connected because of intelligence and this technology. Mm-hmm. So how do we use this technology to advance systems for feeding the poor and doing more? It's out there, it's available, we've got it before us, and that was what we were talking about this morning. How do we ratchet up the game and become more strategic? But anyway, let me stop right there, Mark.
So I hear it's a fragile world at the moment. Let me pull that thread just a bit. So you've said, quite rightly in my estimation, that the heart of genuine leadership is vision and, critically, prevention. So you see problems early and you fix them when they're a manageable size. Can you take us into America and the world in 2034? What are we facing? What should we be doing right now to prevent those problems?
Probably better learn Chinese. We've got to find a path forward. You know, a leader looks to the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. You know, China's looking at the next 100, 200 years. There are a lot of serious issues out there, but I think with AI and a lot of the technological advancements, we've got some opportunities to solve a lot of problems. The question to me is, we're going to make it through the next 10, 20 years. I mean, food insecurity, what's taking place, that the media is not talking about right now, because it's all on the, Kamala and Trump and Gaza and Ukraine. But Africa is so fragile right now, in other places in Asia, because of food insecurity. It's so horrible. Children are dying left and right, Sudan, Somalia, et cetera. And it's going to get worse before it gets better. And what's going to happen? What can we do? But I do have hope. and it's not us versus China. It's all of us together. I do believe that the American people and the Chinese people could be great friends. I do. And I go to China to give speeches. But we've got our work cut out. Yeah. And I've been hard on leaders in private. And I'll usually run everybody out of the room because you got all these, your entourage, and I'll have a heart-to-heart. And I'll a lot of times pull up my chair right face to face and say, I want to talk to you. I want to talk to you. I want to talk to your heart right now. I said, leaders, and I did this at the G7 with the leaders. I said, all of you you're focused on the broken wine glass in the ballroom of the Titanic, or the broken tile in the toilet, and you got an iceberg out front. Mm-hmm. We've got icebergs out front that's solvable, and we're so focused on these small things that are not good. They should be solvable, and should be getting some attention, but not at the expense of the icebergs out there. And I said, you're running around playing whack-a-mole. You just go around and touch it and give a press conference about it. You say a little speech, but your staff's gotten you meeting, and I'm really hard about is strategic planning. You only got so many hours in the day to do so much, and you need to be focused on the icebergs, particularly in a time like this. And you've got this young staff, they mean well, and everybody wants to meet with you. And every meeting you have is really something good. But just because you now clean up the spilt wine on the ballroom carpet at the expense of not addressing the iceberg out front. And I tell the leaders, you've got to slow down, because these issues are solvable. I could tell you several countries that I warned highest levels of leadership a year to 2 years in advance that it would have been a $100 million fix or $1 billion fix. It's now a $100 billion fix because they were too busy on other things. And that's where we are. This is not the night to get into the Western Hemisphere, what we needed to secure it. Maduro, Venezuela. I was involved with the North Korean talks, Venezuela with Maduro, Assad. I can go on into Yemen, the Houthis, the Taliban, because I was on the ground right after all this happened. And you'd be surprised at how many of them want peace. You'd be surprised. But we're not focusing on how to address and solve them, and they are solvable.
I have one more question, then I'm going to turn it over to the audience. But this question is inspired by the fact that we have lots of students here tonight. Can you tell us maybe a story or give us an example of how a younger generation, and perhaps people who don't have a great deal of power, ordinary people, what can they do to help improve the circumstance, our world generally, but some of the particular problems you've just enumerated?
Mother Teresa told this very rich billionaire who asked what he could do, and she said, go love your family, go love your wife, go love your community. So I'm being pretty direct right now on the biggest companies in the world. That you're not going to solve poverty with charity. Charity is very important. But it's got to be development, sustainable, resilience type work. And so I'm challenging them now, and I'm challenging the Wall Street analysts to let these big companies especially, give them longer runway to be a little bit less efficient and a little bit less return on the investment in the poor countries so that we put together the systems in place. Supply chain systems, rule of law, because I have no doubt Africa can feed Africa and Africa can feed the world. It's not that complicated. Now, having said that, right here at home, I would ask everybody in this room, will you be willing to go have lunch this week with somebody of a different political persuasion, different religious persuasion, different color, different economic status, with no agenda other than getting to know your neighbor? And your neighbor isn't just the person, it used to be we used to always know our neighbor, not anymore, But go across the railroad tracks. Maybe it's somebody at work that's, pushing the broom. I'll tell you a story, and many of you have heard, John F. Kennedy was over at the headquarters of NASA. They wanted to put a man on the moon. And he's walking down the hallway, and there's this black man pushing a broom. It's clear what he does. And John F. Kennedy stops and says, young man, what do you do here? It's obvious. And he looks at John F. Kennedy and says, I'm helping put a man on the moon. So beautiful.
Yeah.
Everybody in this city in Columbia, South Carolina, there are poor people out there. There's enough wealth in this city. Republicans and Democrats, we might agree or disagree what government role may be as to that particular issue of poverty or this or that. We might disagree on gay rights and abortion and these, politically sensitive issues. But there's no reason we can't come together in our communities to help the poor, just in our own private capacity. I would ask everybody at church, you go to a church, you go to a synagogue, you go to a mosque, go visit someone, go adopt some families. To me, it's not that complicated. The intellect in this room, the capacity to go help some poor folks, if it's doable, we can solve it right here at home, regardless of our views of government. And I think until individuals assume that responsibility of their neighbor, we will continue to struggle. This should give us more connectivity, but it's given us more division. But a hug, a pat on the back, a smile, an encouragement. If you turn off your social media for a week and cut off Fox and CNN for a week, you can find out we live in a pretty good place. But you turn on the news and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm so mad. I can't believe she said that. Oh, well, look what he said. Anyway. So please, God's created you with a desire to care for your neighbor. And I tell you, it'll reward you more than it will be the poor person you reach out to. So do it.
David, you correctly pointed out that there's a huge collective intelligence in this room. Let's hear it speak, shall we? We have a few questions, and we'll get through as many as we can. Okay, Governor Beasley, the World Food Programme, the United Nations, and other organizations are notoriously difficult to get jobs with. What career advice would you give to young professionals with a passion for global health issues and want to get involved with them?
Boy, that's a pretty serious issue. When I was there, we were like 12, 13,000 direct employees. We contract out with another 20,000-30,000 people. But when I finished, we were at 24,000 direct employees. You got the field workers, which are usually nationals, whether you're in Chad or Cuba or whatever it might be. But then you got the international, and they're usually Harvard, Yale, Princeton. It's amazing the competition. And if you're just an undergrad degree, you're competing against doctoral degrees and master's degrees. And you'll find sometimes that person doesn't have all the degrees, got more common sense. And it's hard. It really is when you're putting it on paper. It really is. Another thing we face in hiring, let me just add, be willing to take the only job that might be available that you don't want. Get in the door. And you will find out, because they'll recognize talent and they'll recognize your heart. And within 6 months or a year, you're moving over here, and next thing you know, you're where you want to be, moving up the system. One of the things I was shocked at the United Nations was gender parity. I was like, the United Nations, gender parity? You're struggling with this? Well, you can imagine hiring people and women in Yemen, in Syria, Afghanistan. Isn't so easy when you're out there in Kandahar, Mazar al-Sharif. Well, and I got stories all on that, but we had 34% of our entire population of employment was women. When I finished, we were at 42%. I hired an additional 4,471 women worldwide in the hardest places of Yemen, in Syria, and et cetera. Mm-hmm. And our organization is so much more strategic. We didn't hire women just to hire. We hired sharp people. And the impact that it had on my operation, my organization, was incredible. And so, go out there. If I can help you in any way, but it's not easy getting those jobs, but they're so, so important. And work with an NGO. Get in with an NGO somewhere. World Vision, Catholic Relief Services, whatever it might be. Get in on the ground. Be willing to volunteer. And things will happen. It just always does. Leaders managers recognize talent.
So this is a cognate question. Do you have advice for a young person, 18 years old, who wants to be a state representative? Well, register to vote would be one of the things, right?
Yeah, register to vote. I've given this talk many times about being young and running for office. If you're running for office for the sake of having office, that's an evil. If you're running for office for the sake of having power, that's an evil. If you're running for office for the sake of achieving things to help people, that's a good thing. So why do you want to run, number one? And number two, engage and involve. A lot of our young people want to start at the top nowadays. They don't want to earn. They don't want to get down on the floor. I mean, oh my goodness, Jimmy, we work 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. And, I was in law school. Well, actually, I was a junior at Clemson, and I was, in law school trying to make it happen. And you got to fight and work hard and balance your family time. It's not easy. So that person, come see me. I will give you some guidance and advice, but get involved, prove yourself, and earn the right to be heard. That's a whole nother story in itself. And people couldn't understand, how do I make such an impact with the Taliban and the Houthis and Pyongyang? And I said, because I've earned the right to be heard. I didn't go out there just like that with them. I listened and began to understand how they were thinking, not agreeing. And once you understand how someone's thinking, like the judge, then you know how to articulate the words that have the most impact. Anyway.
Interesting question. What advice would you give to our presidential candidates? We had to ask, really.
Oh, my goodness. They're wonderful people in both parties. They really are. And I am, quite frankly, disappointed with both parties in so many ways. In my private conversations with my Republicans and Democrats on the Hill, everybody's thinking the same. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that about Kamala or Trump. Now, we got ourselves a mess, but America's strong. I think there's going to be an opportunity after the election to reunite America. I really do. I think people are so fed up with the division, but we're going to have to get this little fight out. Who knows who's going to win? I've got both sides reaching out to me about certain things post-election, which has been interesting, really has. Because when I go to Washington, they see me as the food guy. The Nobel Peace Prize, fed more people, raised more money than anybody, I've heard it, anybody in the history of the world. And so they all want to come together and talk because it makes them feel good. It does, it makes them feel good. And when you read the scriptures, food is a powerful weapon of bringing people together. And I could tell you some stories about the Houthis and the Taliban, how we denied food until they all came together. But you've got two candidates that are at it. God's in the miracle business. I just pray and hope that they keep the rhetoric down. I had a lot of conversations with Ivanka and Trump about, if you just cut the rhetoric down, that's, Kamala's got issues she's got to deal with. Both sides do. But it is what it is. And I think the American people, no matter who's elected, we got to pray and support that leader. And a group of us in the House and the Senate are already talking about how to bring everybody together after the election, no matter what. In fact, we were already talking about several big issues that we're agreeing on now that is really pretty touching, that it'll be post-election. I don't have a magic answer on that. I wish I did. I pray for that the Spirit of the Almighty will touch both candidates and and their campaign teams. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Cut this rhetoric down. It ought to be, I want to be president because there's my vision, not because that guy or that gal's a bad person. That's where we need to be back to, and it's not good, but I still have hope. This is a great country.
None of these questions from the audience are very easy ones, but I'm going to follow through with some of the harder ones. What do you think is the greatest way to help the conflict in the Middle East?
It should have never gotten there. And I'm not going to get too much in detail of that, and I have reasons for saying that. I was involved with Israel and Hamas several years ago when there was a food insecurity situation that had gotten so bad. I want to be careful how I say this, but I was called by Israeli leadership because they trusted that, because they had seen how I dealt with the Houthis and the Taliban and how I moved supplies in to reach people, because some of the nefarious and extremist groups will confiscate, divert aid, and pay their soldiers and families with food aid. Because in a lot of countries, food is all the monetary devices there are. That's it. Food is it. Is nothing else, or very little else. And so I remember as I was dealing with Palestine, I was dealing with Israel, I was dealing with Jordan, I was dealing with Syria, the whole 9 yards, because I was very involved with Aleppo, Idlib, and the whole 9 yards, and Assad's regime. And I'd worked with Israel back then of moving food supplies in because they trusted that I would be hard and be tough and be fair, be neutral, independent, and impartial. And while you're doing all that, you're sensing and seeing, and you're reporting back, which gets complicated because I'm neutral, impartial, independent. But you're reporting back to leaders in Washington, this is bubbling out there, this is getting out of hand. Whether it was Afghanistan we saw, or the Houthis what we saw, or what we saw in the Middle East, as well as what we saw with Russia and Ukraine. And we're all over the place. We're seeing it, we're feeling it, and reporting that something's about to happen. But Syria, for example, should never have happened. It was and is resolvable. We're not taking the temperature down anywhere, and it's all bubbling up globally. If you go back and watch my Nobel Peace Prize speech, I talk about it was a very difficult time. I'd already said 200 years ago, 95% of the people in the world were in extreme poverty. What I didn't tell you was in 1815, we had a volcanic activity that circled the entire planet that brought just millions of people dying all over the world. If we have a major catastrophic event right now of anything close to that degree, there's no way we economically will survive. We will crash globally, and we'll be picking up ourselves from the ashes. And that's what I'm worried about right now. We've got to bring the temperature down. I can't get that much into details. It is complicated, but it's not that complicated. And leaders need to focus. I don't want to get into Netanyahu and the Hamas. You've got some bad stuff happening on both sides. You've got innocent children that are stuck in the middle and are dying. And it's very unfortunate. It really is. I mean, Hamas, it's a whole different ballgame. But when you're executing a war plan, you got to protect innocent people to the degree you can. And this is a difficult situation. The Middle East is tough. But Jordan, Lebanon, it's hard to believe. Lebanon, which, my goodness, 20, 30, 40 years ago, this is the New York of the Middle East. At the World Food Program, when I left, was feeding more Lebanese people. 3-point-something million people of a small country, small population. We were the stabilizing factor in Lebanon. We were the stabilizing factor. Go probably about 20 countries. If we pulled out, they collapse, and ISIS and Al-Qaeda then take over. The Middle East is very vulnerable, yes, of course, but it's not the only vulnerable place that there is. And anyway, let me stop right there.
So we started from the very local, and we've gone global, and I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to bring it back to the local. And this question says, how do you continue the mission to feed the children in your current role here in South Carolina?
So, two things there. One, I continue to voice around the world, just like we did this morning with Democrat and Republican leadership. And I do strategic messaging around the world with the Nobel Peace Prize Committee and with leaders, and whether it's Davos or things like that. But in South Carolina, I accept, because I'll have some of my team members and friends in Washington, New York, why did you accept that speaking engagement in South Carolina? It's too small for you. I'm like, it's not too small for me. I actually accept strategically speaking engagements in South Carolina to inspire and encourage, just like you. What are you going to do in your individual capacity to help the poor and the needy in your neighborhood? You know, you work hard, you're taking care of your family. Have you ever thought about going to another coffee shop? Have you ever thought about going to another store in another part of town and seeing, get out of your routine, and you'll begin to see, wow, it'll be amazing what happens. And so legislation is one thing, but I'm hoping and thinking, me and a couple major D's and R's are talking about, how do we start a grassroots movement across America to love one another again and reconcile? And I think breaking bread and feeding one another and caring for one another is it. How do we do that? It needs to be organic. A friend told me this one time. This was a guy that had mentored Billy Graham. Now think about it. He was a Catholic guy, by the way. And he said, all the darkness in the world can't put out the light of one little match. Think about it. And in this room, you'd have a combustion if everybody lit that light. So,
Governor David Beasley, thank you for your leadership, your courage, and your common human decency. Thank you for being our lecturer tonight.
thank you, Mark. Thank you.